I am telling this story now because the silence has returned. It is the same silence that preceded the beginning of all this, and I have come to recognize it as the sound of a predator listening. For 3 years, there was a rhythm, a terrifying and fragile truce that governed my nights. Now, the rhythm is broken, and I am sitting in a house that is no longer a home, but a cage I built for myself. I am waiting. And I believe it is important that someone knows the sequence of events that led to this vigil, in case the waiting ends in a way that leaves no one to tell it. My name is Eleanor Vance. I am 63 years old. For the last decade, since my husband passed and I retired from my professorship in botany, I have lived alone on this property. It is 160 acres of dense Idaho timber, bisected by a creek and bordered on the north by a sheer granite cliff face. The house was built by my grandfather, a solid log and stone structure that has weathered 80 winters. I know its groans and sighs as intimately as I know my own. I know the scuttling of mice in the attic, the thrum of the generator on a cold night, the exact pitch of the wind as it comes down from the peaks. I know the wildlife here. I know the migratory patterns of the elk, the territorial squabbles of the black bears, and the yipping cadence of the coyote packs that roam the valley floor. I have spent a lifetime, both professionally and personally, observing the rules of the natural world. Its logic is brutal but consistent. I took comfort in that consistency. It was the foundation of my solitude. My companion in this solitude was Buster, a 12-year-old German Shepherd mix with more gray in his muzzle than black. He was a creature of habit, as I am. Our days were measured by routine. At sunrise, we would walk the 2-mile perimeter fence. I would check for downed sections from winter storms or fallen trees, and he would dutifully mark his territory, his senses a far more acute barometer of the wilderness than my own. Afternoons were for tending the garden in the summer or maintaining my equipment in the winter. Evenings were for reading by the fire, Buster asleep at my feet, his paws twitching as he chased dream rabbits. The nights were quiet, filled with the familiar orchestration of the forest. The hoot of a great horned owl, the distant howl of a wolf, the chirping of crickets. These were the sounds of my peace, the sounds of a world operating as it should. The events that shattered this peace began not with a sound, but with a sight, a violation of the rules. It was a Tuesday in late October, 3 years ago. The air had that sharp, clean edge of impending winter, and the aspens in the lower meadow had turned a brilliant, trembling gold. Buster and I were on our morning patrol, walking the western fence line where the property slopes down toward the creek. He stopped abruptly, his body going rigid. A low growl rumbled in his chest, a sound I had not heard from him in years. It was not his usual warning for a bear or a stray deer. This was deeper, more instinctual. It was a sound of profound fear. I followed his gaze to a small clearing about 50 yards from the fence. In the center of it lay the carcass of a bull elk. This was not in itself unusual. Mountain lions and the occasional wolf pack would bring down elk on this land. But as I drew closer, leaving a hesitant Buster by the fence, I felt a creeping wrongness. The ground around the carcass was strangely undisturbed. There were no drag marks, no signs of a prolonged struggle, no scattered fur or churned-up earth that would indicate a pack of wolves had taken it down. The elk just lay there, as if it had simply fallen from the sky. I circled it, my boots crunching on the frosted grass. The scene was clean, too clean. The animal had been dismantled. The hide was peeled back from the torso with an impossible precision, laid out on the ground like a blanket. The rib cage was cracked open, not shattered by the raw force of a bear, but snapped cleanly at the spine. The organs were gone, all of them. The cavity was empty, wiped clean of blood. But it was the bones that truly stopped me. The large femurs, the humeri, the smaller bones of the lower legs, they were all piled neatly to one side. Each one had been scraped clean of every shred of meat and sinew. It was the work of a butcher, not a predator. No wolf or cougar has the dexterity or the inclination for such meticulous work. They tear, they rend, they leave ragged scraps and splintered bone. This was systematic. It was intelligent. I stood there for a long time, the cold air seeping into my coat, trying to force what I was seeing into a logical framework. Poachers? Perhaps. But why would poachers take only the organs and leave the valuable meat and hide? And why would they perform this gruesome butchery on site instead of hauling the carcass out? And there was the pile of bones, cleaned with a surgical thoroughness that spoke of something other than a need for food. It felt ritualistic. I took out my phone and photographed the scene from every angle, the clinical detachment of my old profession taking over. I documented the neatly piled bones, the precisely peeled hide, the unnervingly clean thoracic cavity. Then I looked for tracks. The ground was hard and frosted, not ideal for impressions, but near the creek bed, the soil was softer. And there I found them. 2 of them. They were not the familiar heart shape of a cloven hoof, nor the round clawed print of a bear. They were canine, unmistakably so. A large central pad, 4 distinct toe pads. But the size was staggering. I placed my gloved hand next to one. My hand, from the tip of my middle finger to the base of my palm, measures 7.5 inches. The print was a full 12 inches long and nearly 8 inches wide. But even that was not the most disturbing part. The prints were deep, pressed into the earth with the weight of a creature far heavier than any wolf. And the stride, the distance between the 2 prints I found, was over 6 feet. It was a bipedal stride, 1 foot directly in front of the other. A wolf, a bear, a cougar, they all walk on 4 legs. Their tracks leave a distinct quadrupedal pattern. This was the pattern of something that walked on 2. My mind raced, grasping for explanations. A prank? Some local kids with a twisted sense of humor and a set of custom-made boot attachments. It seemed elaborate, pointlessly so. A misidentified bear track, perhaps a double step where the hind paw landed perfectly on top of the forepaw print? Possible, but unlikely to be so clear, so perfectly formed, and it did not explain the carcass. I spent the rest of the day in a state of anxious distraction. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep. Every shadow in the woods seemed to hold a watching shape. Buster refused to leave the porch, sitting with his back pressed against the front door, his head constantly swiveling, scanning the tree line. That night, I locked the deadbolts for the first time in years. I sat with my grandfather's old Winchester rifle across my lap, the cold weight of the steel a small, insufficient comfort. The familiar sounds of the forest were gone. The owls were silent. The crickets did not chirp. A profound and unnatural quiet had fallen over my 160 acres. It was a listening silence, and I felt, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that I was the one being listened to. The days that followed were a slow, agonizing descent into a new reality. I became a forensic investigator on my own land. I purchased several high-end trail cameras, the kind used by professional wildlife photographers, and placed them in strategic locations, focusing on the area where I found the carcass and along the game trails that crisscrossed my property. I started a new journal, not for botanical observations, but for anomalies. I recorded everything with meticulous detail: the date, the time, the atmospheric conditions, the exact location of any new findings. My entries began to read like the log of a scientist studying an entirely new and deeply unsettling ecosystem. On the 4th day, I found the fence. The western perimeter, the same one Buster and I walked every morning, was made of high-tensile steel wire stretched between thick cedar posts. It was designed to keep cattle in and, to a lesser extent, large wildlife out. I found a section, about 100 yards from the elk carcass, that had been damaged. 2 of the cedar posts, each 8 inches in diameter, were snapped at the base. Not rotted, not pushed over, snapped. The splintered wood pointed to a single, massive application of force. The steel wires between them, each rated for over 1,000 pounds of pressure, were not cut. They were stretched, elongated to the point of metallic exhaustion, and then torn. The ends were curled back like peeled wire insulation. I measured the distance between the 2 broken posts. It was just over 9 feet. Something had passed through the fence, not by climbing over or digging under, but by simply walking through it, breaking aside posts and wire as if they were twigs. I logged it in my journal, my hands shaking slightly as I wrote. The nights became the worst part. The silence persisted, a heavy blanket that smothered the familiar sounds of life. But new sounds began to intrude. At first it was distant, a low, guttural vocalization that was too deep to be a coyote, too complex to be a wolf. It wasn't a howl. It was more like a series of clicks and throaty growls, a form of communication that was utterly alien to me. It would echo down from the high ridges, and Buster would press himself into my side, trembling. Then, the sounds came closer. One night, I was woken by a sharp crack. I went to the window and saw one of the massive oak trees at the edge of my yard swaying violently, though the air was perfectly still. As I watched, a large lower branch, thicker than my thigh, was simply torn from the trunk with a sound of splintering wood and dropped to the ground. There was no wind, no lightning, just a silent, brutal display of strength in the moonlight. I could see no shape, no figure responsible. The branch was just removed. The trail cameras yielded nothing but frustration. For weeks, they captured the usual procession of deer, raccoons, and the occasional black bear. But on the nights when the strange vocalizations were closest, the cameras would record nothing but static. I would retrieve the memory cards to find hours of footage corrupted, displaying a strange, pixelated wash of green and gray noise, precisely during the times I had heard the sounds. Sometimes, a single, uncorrupted frame would be captured just before the static began. It was always the same, a blur of dark motion at the very edge of the frame, a shape that was too tall and moved too fast to be identifiable. And on 2 separate occasions, I captured a pair of eyes. They glowed with a bright, self-illuminating amber light, reflecting the camera's infrared flash from a height of what I estimated to be over 7 feet off the ground. They were too far apart to belong to any known predator in these mountains. A pervasive smell began to accompany these events. It was a thick, musky odor, a deeply unpleasant combination of wet fur, rotting meat, and something else, something metallic and sharp, like old blood. It would drift in on the evening air, thick and cloying, and Buster would begin to whine, his nose twitching. It was a territorial marking, I realized, a scent fence. Whatever this thing was, it was claiming my land. It was claiming me. My carefully constructed world of logic and reason was crumbling. I was living in the epicenter of something impossible, something ancient and predatory that did not exist in any of my biology textbooks. The intellectual puzzle had become a gnawing, visceral fear. I was being circled, tested. The displays of strength, the scent marking, the vocalizations. It was the classic behavior of a large predator establishing a new territory. I felt like a field mouse cowering in its burrow while a hawk circles overhead, my sturdy log home feeling more and more like a flimsy shelter of grass. The first direct sighting happened a month after I found the elk. It was dusk, that gray, liminal time when the world loses its sharp edges. I was securing the storm shutters on the kitchen window, a task I had added to my evening routine. Buster was inside, barking frantically, a raw, panic sound that was becoming distressingly common. I finished latching the shutter and turned, my eyes scanning the tree line that bordered the yard, about 70 yards from the house. And there it was. It was not a clear view. It stood between 2 large pines, partially obscured by shadow and the failing light. But it was clear enough. It was tall, impossibly tall. Its shoulders were broad, wider than any man I had ever seen. The silhouette was humanoid, but wrong. The proportions were elongated, the limbs too long for the torso. It was covered in what looked like thick, dark fur that matted in the damp air. And it was standing on 2 legs, perfectly still, watching me. I couldn't make out facial features, only the general shape of a head that was more canine than human, with a pronounced muzzle and what looked like pointed ears atop its skull. It just stood there, a statue carved from shadow. We were locked in that tableau for what felt like an eternity, though it was likely no more than a minute. I felt a cold dread wash over me, a primal terror that bypassed all rational thought. This was not an animal. It was not a man in a suit. This was something else. As the last of the light faded, it took one slow step back, melting into the deeper darkness of the forest. It did not run. It simply receded. I stumbled back into the house, my heart hammering against my ribs. I locked the door and leaned against it, gasping for air. Buster was at my side, whining, licking my trembling hand. That was the moment the last of my skepticism died. I had seen it. It was real, and it was here. My scientific mind, which had been desperately trying to find a rational explanation, was finally silenced by the sheer, irrefutable reality of what I had witnessed. The question was no longer what it was, but what it wanted. That night, sleep was impossible. I sat in my armchair, the Winchester in my lap, listening. Around midnight, I heard a sound from the front porch. It wasn't the aggressive scratching of a bear. It was a soft, rhythmic scrape. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. I crept to the peephole, my breath held tight in my chest. I could see nothing but the dark wood of the porch floor. But I could hear it, the sound of breathing. A low, wet, guttural respiration, punctuated by a soft, sniffing sound. It was methodically examining my front door. It was learning my home. An idea began to form in my mind, born of sheer terror and a desperate, illogical hope. This creature was intelligent. Its actions were not random. The meticulous carcass, the displays of strength, the surveillance. It was all deliberate. It was behaving like a territorial predator, and I was an anomaly in its territory. I could fight it, turn my home into a fortress, and live in a state of perpetual siege. Or, perhaps, I could try something else. I remembered stories my grandfather used to tell, old tales from the native tribes that once lived in these mountains. Stories of powerful spirits of the forest, spirits that you did not fight, but that you placated, spirits to whom you showed respect. My heart pounding, I went to the large deep freezer in the pantry. I pulled out a 2-pound package of ground venison from a deer I had harvested earlier in the fall. My hand shook so badly I could barely unwrap it. With the breathing sound still audible from the other side of the door, I unlocked the deadbolt. I didn't open the door. There was a small, foot-square sliding panel at the bottom, a dog door my husband had installed for our previous dog years ago, which I had since bolted shut. I slid back the bolts, opened the small door, and pushed the block of frozen meat out onto the porch. Then I slammed the panel shut and re-bolted it. The breathing sound stopped. I heard a soft, wet tearing noise, then the sound of lapping. It lasted for less than 5 minutes. Then, silence. I waited, my ear pressed to the door, for what felt like hours. Nothing. The presence was gone. The oppressive weight in the air had lifted. For the first time in a month, I heard the chirp of a cricket from the yard. The truce had begun. The next morning, I found the plastic wrapping from the venison sitting neatly on my doormat. It was licked clean, with no tears or teeth marks. The small offering had been accepted. That night, I put out another package of meat. And the next night, and the night after that, a routine was established, a bizarre and terrifying covenant. Every evening at 9 o'clock, I would place 2 pounds of meat on a heavy ceramic platter and slide it out the small door. Every morning, the platter would be back on the doormat, licked so clean it shone. For a few weeks, I tried to convince myself that I was just feeding a very large, very intelligent bear. But bears hibernate. My nightly visitor did not. Through the deepest snows of winter, when the temperature dropped to 20 below zero and the world was buried in white, the offering was always taken. The platter was always returned. I never saw it clearly. Sometimes, through the peephole, I would catch a glimpse of a massive, furred hand with long, dark claws reaching for the platter. Other times, I would see only a vast shadow eclipsing the porch light. But its presence was a constant. Buster learned the routine. Every night, a few minutes before 9, he would go to the front door and let out a single, low woof. Not a bark of aggression, but a notification, a signal that our visitor was approaching. During the first year of this arrangement, I made one and only one attempt to involve the outside world. A neighboring rancher, about 5 miles down the valley, reported losing 2 calves in a single night. The story made the local paper. The official explanation was a wolf pack. I knew better. I called the county sheriff, a man named Dave Haskins whom I had known for 20 years. I invited him out to the property, not mentioning my nightly visitor, but framing it as a concern about an aggressive predator in the area. He arrived in his dusty Ford pickup, a pot-bellied man whose skepticism was his most prominent feature. I showed him the photographs of the elk carcass. He grunted. "Looks like poachers, Eleanor. Kids, probably. Get a kick out of this weird stuff." I showed him the pictures of the broken fence posts. "Bear," he said, with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Big one, maybe. They can do a lot of damage when they're angry." Finally, I showed him the plaster cast I had made of the track I found by the creek. I had spent hours on it, carefully preserving every detail. He held the heavy 12-inch-long cast in his hands, turning it over. He looked at the canine pads, the clear imprint of claws that were not retractile, the sheer impossible size of it. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not belief, but uncertainty. Then he sighed, his face settling back into its familiar mask of weary authority. "It's a double step, Eleanor. A big black bear puts its back paw down right where its front paw was. Smudges the print, makes it look all long and weird like this. Happens all the time." He handed the cast back to me. He then gave me a long, searching look, his expression softening with a kind of pity that was more insulting than his disbelief. "It's lonely out here," he said, his voice gentle. "Especially since Robert passed. The mind can play tricks on you. You see a shadow, you hear a branch break, and suddenly it's a monster in the woods." He suggested I get a better security system, maybe spend a few weeks in town with my sister. He was not listening to the evidence. He was diagnosing my grief. He saw a lonely old woman, not a credible witness. That conversation was a turning point. It solidified my isolation. I realized then that the world of men and laws was of no use to me. The rules that governed my life were now dictated by the creature that waited in the woods, and I was utterly, completely on my own. I thanked Sheriff Haskins for his time, walked him to his truck, and never spoke of it to another soul again. So began the long years of the new normal. My life, once governed by the sun and seasons, was now governed by a single nightly ritual. The world shrank to the perimeter of my property, and my existence became a strange domesticity with a monster. I learned its habits. It was most active during the new moon and in the hours just before a storm. It never made the same vocalizations twice, its language a complex and shifting tapestry of clicks, growls, and deep, resonant calls that sounded disturbingly like a distorted human voice. I continued to maintain the trail cameras, more out of scientific habit than any real hope of capturing a clear image. The results were always the same: corrupted files, fleeting blurs, and the occasional pair of glowing amber eyes. One time, I got something more. A single clear frame from a camera positioned high in an old pine tree, looking down. The image showed the top of its head and massive shoulders as it passed beneath. The fur was thick and black, glistening with moisture. The head was distinctly lupine, with a long muzzle and tall, erect ears. It confirmed what I already knew. The term from old folklore surfaced in my mind, a word I had once dismissed as rural superstition. DOGMAN. This routine, this fragile peace, lasted for 3 years and 2 months. I became accustomed to the fear. It became a dull, constant ache in the background of my life, like a chronic illness. I never missed a feeding. I kept my deep freezer stocked with venison and beef, buying it in bulk from a butcher in the next county to avoid suspicion. The creature, for its part, upheld its end of the bargain. The overt displays of aggression stopped. The vocalizations became more distant. The feeling of being watched remained, but it felt less like the gaze of a predator sizing up its prey, and more like the watchful eye of a landlord. I was living on its land, and the nightly offering was my rent. I was safe, as long as I paid. The end of the truce came with the storm. The weather reports had been calling for it for a week, a once-in-a-decade blizzard that was set to stall over the Rockies. I prepared as best I could. I stocked up on firewood, canned goods, and generator fuel. I filled the bathtubs with water. What I did not account for was the sheer, unrelenting force of the snow. It began on a Thursday afternoon, and by the time I was due for the nightly feeding, a foot had already accumulated. The wind howled, a physical presence that slammed against the house and rattled the window panes. I placed the platter of meat outside as usual, but the wind was so strong it blew the snow into the small dog door, creating a drift in my pantry. The power went out around 2 in the morning. I was woken by the sudden, deafening silence as the hum of the refrigerator and freezer died. The generator, buried under what was now several feet of snow, refused to start. This was a problem. My main supply of meat was in the large chest freezer in the pantry, which was now just an insulated box. I had a few days, maybe, before the contents would begin to spoil. But my more immediate problem was the offering for the coming night. By Friday evening, the snow was over 4 feet deep and still falling. The world outside my windows was a swirling vortex of white. Getting to the woodshed for more fuel for the fire was a dangerous, exhausting ordeal. I had no way to clear a path. I was trapped. At 9 o'clock, I stood before the small door in the pantry, my stomach twisting into a knot of dread. I had nothing to give. My supply of fresh meat in the now dead refrigerator was gone. The chest freezer was sealed by the cold, and even if I could get it open, everything inside was frozen solid. For the first time in 1,186 days, I had no offering. Buster seemed to know. He did not give his usual notification woof. He stood beside me, a low, continuous growl vibrating in his chest, his eyes fixed on the small, bolted door. I did nothing. I could do nothing. I went back to the living room and sat in the dark, the Winchester across my lap, listening to the storm. But over the shriek of the wind, I began to hear a new sound, a low, questioning growl from just outside the front door. It was not the sound I had heard before. It held a different note, an edge of confusion, of impatience. The rent was due, and I had failed to pay. The sound continued for an hour, a deep, resonant rumble that I could feel in the floorboards. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was somehow more terrifying. I stayed awake all night, my senses stretched to their breaking point, but I heard nothing more. The next morning, the snow had finally stopped. The world was buried, silent and white. When I looked out the window, I saw them. Tracks. Massive bipedal tracks circling the house. They were deep, sunk 2 feet into the fresh snow. It had spent hours circling my home, testing, observing. The path it wore in the snow was a perfect predatory ring. My cage was being inspected. The second night was worse. The storm was over, but the temperature plummeted. The house grew dangerously cold. I huddled with Buster under a pile of blankets, my breath pluming in the frigid air. The sun set, and the world outside turned a cold, deep blue. The waiting began. At 9 o'clock, the sound started again, this time at the back of the house. Scratching. Not the frantic clawing of an animal, but a slow, deliberate scrape. The sound of a single, heavy claw being drawn down the thick oak of the back door. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. It was testing the wood, feeling for weakness. Buster was beside himself, barking with a ferocity I had never heard from him, a desperate last-ditch defense of his home. The scratching went on for hours. It moved from the back door to the windows, testing each shutter. I could hear its heavy footsteps in the snow, a soft crunching that moved with a terrifyingly calm and methodical pace. It was no longer just a landlord, it was a predator whose routine had been broken, and it was trying to understand why. It was trying to get in. By the third night, I was exhausted, running on pure adrenaline and fear. I had managed to break apart a small end table for firewood, creating a small, flickering circle of warmth in the vast, cold darkness of the house. I had eaten the last of my canned beans. I knew, with a chilling certainty, that this would be the night. The testing would end. The sound started earlier this time, just after sunset. It was no longer patient. A loud bang echoed from the side of the house as it slammed its body against the wall. The log structure shuddered. I heard a deep, guttural roar of frustration, a sound that shook the very foundations of my courage. I retreated to my bedroom, the safest and most defensible room in the house. The door was solid oak, the window small and high. I dragged a heavy chest of drawers in front of the door and sat on the bed with Buster, the shotgun held tight in my numb fingers. For a long time, there was only silence. The profound, listening silence. Then I heard it. A new sound. It came from the pantry, a low, splintering creak. It was not working on the doors anymore. It had found another way. I realized with a jolt of ice-cold terror what it was doing. The pantry had a small window, barely a foot high and 2 feet wide, set near the ceiling for ventilation. It was an old single-pane window in a wooden frame that I had always meant to replace. I heard the sound of wood groaning, then snapping. Then the tinkle of broken glass falling to the floor. It was inside my house. The silence that followed was the most terrifying thing I have ever experienced. My home, my sanctuary for 63 years, had been breached. It was no longer mine. I could hear it moving. The soft, heavy tread of its feet on the wooden floorboards of the kitchen. The slow, deliberate sniff of the air. It was not rampaging. It was exploring, searching. I could hear it knock over a tin of flour, the soft poof of the powder settling. I heard the metallic scrape as it nudged the now silent refrigerator. It was looking for the food. It was looking for the payment. Buster was silent now, pressed against my legs, trembling so violently I could feel it through my own body. He knew. We were no longer defending a perimeter. We were prey, cornered in our den. The footsteps left the kitchen and came down the hall. They stopped outside my bedroom door. I aimed the shotgun at the center of the door, my finger on the trigger, my own breathing a ragged, hitching sound in the stillness. I could hear its breath on the other side. A deep, slow, wet sound. A low chuff, like a wolf tasting the air. It knew I was in there. It could smell my fear. It did not try the handle. It did not throw its weight against the wood. It just stood there, waiting. Its immense presence was a physical weight against the door. I felt pinned, observed, judged. In that moment, I understood. This was not about hunger, not anymore. It was about the broken agreement. It was a demonstration. It was showing me that the locks, the walls, the illusion of safety I had built meant nothing. It could get to me whenever it wanted, if it wanted to. After an eternity that lasted perhaps 5 minutes, the footsteps receded. I heard it walk back down the hall, through the kitchen. I heard the crunch of it exiting through the broken window frame. And then, it was gone. The oppressive presence lifted. The silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was the silence of an empty house, a violated space. The storm broke the next day. A neighbor with a plow cleared my driveway by the afternoon. The power was restored by evening. The first thing I did was check the damage. The pantry window was gone, the entire frame torn cleanly from the wall. Inside, a few things were knocked over, but nothing was truly destroyed. On the floor, in a spill of flour, was a single, perfect footprint. 12 inches long. It was a message. I have lived in a different world since that night. The truce is over, replaced by a new, much darker arrangement. I have not missed a payment since. I had steel security doors installed, with multiple deadbolts and reinforced frames. The windows have been replaced with shatterproof glass and are barred with solid steel. My house is a fortress now, but it is also a prison. I sleep with the Winchester by my bed. Buster rarely leaves my side, his old age now marked by a permanent, anxious vigilance. I still make the offering every night. 2 pounds of fresh meat placed on the heavy ceramic platter, but it is not a gesture of appeasement anymore. It is a payment made under duress. It is a tax for my continued existence. Sometimes, when I watch through the tiny reinforced slit in my new front door, I see it. The shadow detaches itself from the deeper shadows of the woods and moves with a fluid, unnatural grace onto the porch. It no longer just takes the food and leaves. It will sometimes linger. It will stand there, the platter in its massive clawed hand, and it will look directly at the door, directly at the spot where it knows I am watching. Its amber eyes glow in the darkness, and in them I see a cold, ancient intelligence, an understanding. It knows I am trapped. It knows I am afraid. I am telling this story because last week I found something new, a dead squirrel, laid carefully on my front step. It was not torn or mangled. It was presented like a gift, a contribution. It was a gesture I do not understand, and that is what terrifies me most. The rules are changing again. It is no longer just taking, it is beginning to give. The silence has returned, that listening, predatory stillness in the woods. I feel its gaze on the house, even in the brightest daylight. The debt is never paid, it is only postponed, and I fear, with every fiber of my being, that it is beginning to think of me as more than just a source of food. I fear it is beginning to think of me as a neighbor.